In this video, I want to critique John Mearsheimer's take on the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay, let us start.
Does offensive realism answer the question why Hitler attacked the Soviet Union?
Yes.
Because from a military strategy perspective, there's pros and cons to that decision.
Pros and cons to every decision. The question is, did he think that he could win a quick and decisive victory? And he did. I mean, as did his generals. It's very interesting. I've spent a lot of time studying German decision-making in World War II. If you look at the German decision to invade Poland on September 1st, 1939, and you look at the German decision to invade France on May 10th, 1940, and then the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. What you see is there was actually quite a bit of resistance to Hitler in 1938 at the time of Czechoslovakia, Munich. And there was also quite a bit of resistance in September 1939.
Internally, or you mean?
Internally, for sure. Yeah. People had doubts. They didn't think the Wehrmacht was ready. And given the fact that World War I had just ended about 20 years before, the thought of starting another European war was not especially attractive to lots of German policymakers, including military leaders. And then came France, 1940. In the run-up to May 10th, 1940, there was huge resistance in the German army to attacking France. But that was eventually eliminated because they came up with a clever plan, the Manstein Plan. If you look at the decision to invade the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, which is the only case where they fail. They succeeded in France, they succeeded in Poland, they succeeded at Munich in 1938. Soviet Union is where they fail. There's hardly any resistance at all, right?
Yeah. Well, and to say that they failed the Soviet Union, I mean, my grandfather fought, from the Soviet Union, there was a lot of successes early on.
Okay, let me explain why did Hitler think he could win a war against a much bigger country that not only had way more people, but also had much greater industrial capabilities. While the Soviets were able to produce somewhere around 20,000 tanks, the Wehrmacht had at their peak somewhere around 4,000 tanks. Well, Hitler believed he could win because after the quick fall of France, he began to believe in this myth that the Germans will always win due to the strength of their will. And that actually reminds me of what the ancient Romans back in the days of the Republic believed. One great Roman thinker actually said that the Roman military will always prevail due to the strength of the Roman will, the will to victory. And also, Nazi generals, they looked at the war between Soviet Union and Finland, and while the Soviet Union did win the war, they suffered such catastrophic casualties that the Germans, they just assumed that they would be able to conquer Soviet Union because their military was in a very bad shape. But some very important things actually changed in the Soviet Union precisely in the period between the Winter War, the war between Soviet Union and Finland, and between the Nazi invasion of Germany. Important thing number one, tank T-34 was massively produced precisely in that period. And Hitler was later even convinced that Stalin was hiding the tank cunningly from him, but he wasn't. The tank just wasn't being massively produced prior to Hitler's invasion. And also, what happened as the Soviet generals, as they gained the experience they needed, they became better. And also what happened is, as Zhukov moved up the Soviet ladder of command, that was maybe even the decisive factor for victory on the Eastern Front, because Zhukov happened to be a military genius that copied the Blitzkrieg in many aspects and turned that technique against the Germans in the end. But okay, let us continue this interview.
So there's poor military, I would say, strategic decisions along the way, but it caught Stalin off guard. Maybe you can correct me, but from my perspective, terrifyingly so, they could have been successful if certain different decisions were made from a military perspective.
Yeah, I've always had the sense they came terrifyingly close to winning.
Yeah.
You could make the opposite argument that they were doomed, but I'm not terribly comfortable making that argument. I think the Wehrmacht by the summer of 1941 was a finely tuned instrument for war. And the Red Army was in quite terrible shape. Stalin had purged the officer corps. They had performed poorly in Finland, and there were all sorts of reasons to think that they were no match for the Wehrmacht. And if you look at what happened in the initial stages of the conflict, that proved to be the case. The Germans won a lot of significant tactical victories early on.
And if they focused and went to Moscow as quickly as possible, it's, again, terrifyingly so, could have been basically topple Stalin. And one thing
that's possible. Fortunately, we're not going to run the experiment again, but one could argue that had they concentrated, as the generals wanted to do, in going straight for Moscow, that they would have won. I mean, what Hitler wanted to do is he wanted to go into the Ukraine. I mean, Hitler thought that the main axis, there were three axes. The northern axis went towards Leningrad. The central axis, of course, went to Moscow. And then the southern axis, Army Group South, headed towards Ukraine and deep into the Caucasus. And Hitler believed that that should have been the main axis. And in fact, in 1942, the Germans go back on the offensive in 1942. This is Operation Blue. And the main axis in 42 is deep into the Ukraine and into the Caucasus. Mm-hmm. And that fails. But one could argue that had they done that in 41, had they not gone to Moscow, had they concentrated on going deep into Ukraine and into the Caucasus, they could have knocked the Soviets out that way. I'm not sure that in the end I believe that. I think in the end the Soviets would have won no matter what, but I'm not 100% sure of that.
So sometimes maybe you can educate me, but sometimes, they say, just like with Napoleon, winter defeated Hitler.
Okay, I just want to add, this is an interesting thesis that actually makes much more sense to me than this idea that conquering Moscow could result in Hitler winning the war, because let us remember, well, Napoleon conquered Moscow and he still didn't win the war. And, the Wehrmacht still would have been faced with a lack of resources, lack of oil and other, primarily oil, but other important resources that were mostly located in the south. And so Hitler was, in my humble opinion, actually right when compared to his generals, when he said that the priority is actually to conquer the oil fields in the Caucasus. And the thing is, had they early on concentrated on the southern flank, well, maybe they would have been able to win the Battle of Stalingrad and conquer the oil fields in the Caucasus. But the problem is, if the Soviets destroyed all the equipment, then how would they actually in short time manage to build new equipment, pull the oil out from the earth, and then somehow transport that oil back to locations where the German military needed the oil? Not to mention that the Soviets would be attacking them through this entire process. There would be Soviet guerrillas cutting their supply lines. So even holding that huge territory would be an enormous problem for Hitler, not to mention that, well, there was the Western Front, and Hitler, just to hold that enormous territory, had to waste a lot of his men and resources, and yeah, the Soviets, they would just continue to attack and destroy oil, as Hitler was pulling the oil or would be pulling the oil out from the earth in this scenario. So yeah, I'm also highly skeptical of this idea that even had Hitler conquered the oil fields, that that would result in Germany winning. I see only two scenarios that would allow Hitler to win. Scenario number one: Japan attacks the Soviet Union instead of the United States. But why the Japanese? Why did they have no interest in attacking Stalin? Well, first of all, their main economic competitor was the United States. Then the hatred between the United States and Japan existed well, for a long time. There was a lot of anti-Japanese hatred and racism in the United States, and for example, the Japanese in California, they weren't allowed to buy land in the early 20th century. That also pissed off the Japanese, and eventually they attacked Roosevelt, or they attacked the Americans when Roosevelt froze all the Japanese assets on American soil. And Roosevelt did it as punishment for the Japanese invasion of Vietnam. And while Stalin was desperately trying to not provoke the Japanese, Roosevelt was constantly provoking them by freezing their assets, by helping the Kuomintang in China. So yeah, it made no sense for the Japanese military to attack the Soviets. And scenario number two is, had the Nazis developed nuclear weapons, then I think they would be able probably to win. If they developed like a enormous amount of them, then definitely they would. But okay, let us continue.
In Russia, I think not often enough people tell the story of the soldiers and the motivation and how hard they fight. So it turns out the Ukrainians and Russians are not easy to conquer. They're the kinds of people that don't roll over and fight bravely. There seems to be a difference in certain peoples in how they see war, how they approach war, how proud they are to fight for their country, to die for their country, these kinds of things. So I think Battle of Stalingrad tells, at least to me, a story of extremely brave fighting on the Soviet side. And it's a component of war too. It's not just structural. It's not just military strategy. It's also the humans involved. But maybe that's a romantic notion of war.
No, I think there's a great deal of truth in that, but let's just unpack it a bit in the case of the Soviet Union in World War II. The counter argument to that is that in World War I, the Russian army disintegrated. And if you look at what happened when Napoleon invaded in 1812, and you look at what happened in 1917, and then you look at what happened between 41 and 45, the Napoleon case looks a lot like the Hitler case, and it fits neatly with your argument. But World War I does not fit neatly with your argument because the Russians lost and surrendered.
Yeah.
And you had the infamous Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where the Soviet Union then, because it went from Russia to the Soviet Union in October 1917, the Soviet Union surrendered large amounts of Soviet territory because it had suffered a humiliating defeat. My argument for why the Russians, let me take that back, why the Soviets fought like wild dogs in World War II is that they were up against a genocidal adversary. You want to understand that the Germans murdered huge numbers of Soviet POWs. The overall total was 3.7 million. And by December December of 1941, remember the invasion is June 41, by December of 1941, the Germans have murdered 2 million Soviet POWs. At that point in time, they had murdered many more POWs than they had murdered Jews. And this is not to deny for 1 second that they were on a murderous rampage when it came to Jews. But they were also on a murderous rampage when it came to Soviet citizens and Soviet soldiers, right? So those Soviet soldiers quickly came to understand that they were fighting for their lives. If they were taken prisoner, they would die. So they fought like wild dogs.
Yeah, the story of the Holocaust of the 6 million Jews is often told extensively. If Hitler conquered the Soviet Union, it's terrifying to think on a much grander scale than the Holocaust what would have happened to the Slavic people, to the Soviet people.
Absolutely. All you have to do is read the Hunger Plan, right? And they also had a plan, what is it called? Grand Plan East. I forget the exact name of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what John Mearsheimer says in this clip, and Gavril Popov actually makes the very same argument in his book, The Three Wars of Stalin. I would highly recommend to you to read this book. It is an interesting book, and it is actually, the book is actually a hidden critique of Putin, which I actually didn't know until a professor told me that. But I digress. So Gavril Popov argues that the main reason for why Hitler lost the war was his extreme racism that prevented many of the people that were oppressed under the Soviet Union, such as the Chechens, the Ukrainians, even some Russians, and the Balkars, for example. They were a Buddhist people that partially at least fought for Hitler. But when you look at the percentages of these populations, whether we are talking about Ukrainians, Balkars, Chechens, still an overwhelming majority of them fought for the Red Army. And why is that? Because the Red Army wasn't racist towards them, at least not openly. And it wasn't genocidal towards them, not in the same way. At least, even if you want to argue that Stalin committed genocide, well, his plans definitely weren't as genocidal as Hitler's. Not to mention that, of course, people will always rebel more against a foreign enemy that's killing them than against their own state. And Stalin was able to utilize patriotism. For example, among the Cossacks that hated communism, he was able to play on this notion of Cossack patriotism, and he was kind of able to make the argument, remember the First World War where you fought with the Germans, now you are repeating that in this great patriotic war. And many Cossacks were actually glad that they get to, in their eyes, avenge their honor and avenge the defeat of the First World War that the Cossacks suffered from the German military. So yeah, Hitler's main mistake was being extremely racist, but then again, that is what made him Hitler in the first place. Okay, if you like this video, then don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and see you in the next video.